The Mediterranean, did not always exist. The sea you see on maps, that elongated body of water separating Europe from northern Africa, which has been for millennia the center of the known world, the cradle of civilizations, the route of sailors and merchants, that sea has a history far older and far stranger than any human history can reflect. The event we will explore tonight has a technical name, the Messinian Salinity Crisis. The name comes from the geological stage in which it occurred, the Messinian, which is the last stage of the Miocene, and from the main consequence of the event, which was a massive salt accumulation in the Mediterranean basin. But the technical name does not capture the scale of what happened. What captures the scale is simply thinking of the Mediterranean, that sea of nearly 2.5 million square kilometers, with depths of up to 4.5 kilometers at its deepest point, and then imagining that space empty. A hole. A salt canyon. A desert 3 kilometers below sea level where rivers fell into the void. The Mediterranean story is also a story about scale. About the difference between the scale at which we experience the world and the scale at which the world actually operates. On the human scale, a sea is a permanent feature, something that will be there long after any living person is gone. On the geological scale, a sea is a temporary arrangement of water in a basin, dependent on the continuation of specific tectonic and climatic conditions that are themselves changing. The Mediterranean story makes that difference in scale viscerally real in a way that abstract discussion of geological time cannot. The Messinian Salinity Crisis was discovered in 1970 when the scientific drilling ship Glomar Challenger drilled the Mediterranean floor and found beneath normal marine sediments enormous layers of salt and gypsum that could only have formed by massive evaporation. That discovery was immediately recognized by the scientists aboard as one of the most important geological finds of the century, and in the 50 years since has generated extraordinarily rich scientific research that continues producing new revelations. There is also something especially fitting for sleep in the Mediterranean story. It is a story that begins with a calm sea, passes through the drama of evaporation and flood, and ends with the sea as we know it today, quiet beneath the Mediterranean sky, receiving Atlantic waves through the Strait of Gibraltar with the same constancy with which it has received them for 5 million years. 5.5 million years ago, the Mediterranean disappeared. It was not an instantaneous event. It was not the opening of a drain that emptied the sea in a matter of hours. It was a process of thousands of years, slow in human terms but nearly instantaneous in geological terms, during which one of the largest bodies of water on the planet lost its connection to the ocean feeding it, began to evaporate under the late Miocene sun, and shrank until it became a series of hypersaline lakes at the bottom of a basin more than 3 kilometers below sea level. What remained where the Mediterranean had been was a desert of salt and gypsum, hostile in the extreme, battered by heat, surrounded by the vertical cliffs of European and African coastlines that now rose high above the basin floor like the walls of an impossible canyon. And at that floor, the great rivers of southern Europe, the Nile in Africa, the Rhone in France, the Ebro in Spain, continued flowing toward where the sea had been, and on reaching the edge of the ancient continent they fell vertically, thousands of meters, carving canyons in the rock that today lie buried under the modern Mediterranean. That world lasted approximately 200,000 years. And then it ended in the most spectacular way that Earth's history records. The Atlantic broke through again. The ocean's water began crossing the barrier that had separated it from the Mediterranean, first as a trickle, then as a river, then as a waterfall, then as the greatest flood that any geology has produced in millions of years. In the space of months, or perhaps years, or perhaps centuries, the Mediterranean filled again. The sea that exists today is the heir of that flood. That story, the story of how the Mediterranean evaporated and filled again, is called the Messinian Salinity Crisis. It is one of the most extraordinary geological events of the last 10 million years, and it is also one of the least known to the general public. Tonight we are going to explore it together. There is something especially powerful in the idea that the Mediterranean disappeared, Because the Mediterranean is not for Western civilization just any sea. It is the sea. It is the center around which the first complex civilizations of our history were built, the stage of Greece and Rome, of Phoenician trade and medieval Islam, of the Crusades and the Renaissance. Mare Nostrum, the Romans called it, our sea. And that sea, which seems as ancient as anything human history can conceive, was dry. Tonight we are going to explore that event with all the slowness and attention it deserves. Not as a scientific curiosity, but as a story about the world we inhabit, about the impermanence of what seems most solid, and about the capacity of the planet to produce scenarios that no human mind could invent. To understand how the Mediterranean disappeared, one must first understand where it came from. The modern Mediterranean is not a geographical accident. It is the last remnant of a much larger ocean that existed for tens of millions of years and that connected what are today the Atlantic and Indian Oceans through what is now Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia. The connection of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic has a long and complex history that is itself fascinating. During the Cretaceous and Paleogene, the Western Tethys connected the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, and waters circulated freely among all three oceans through what is today Northern Africa and the Middle East. That free circulation changed radically as tectonic plates began reorganizing that region's geography. The Tethys Ocean's closure also created the conditions for the most dramatic mountain building events in recent geological history. The collision of India with Asia, which closed the Eastern Tethys, produced the Himalayas. The collision of Arabia with Asia produced the Zagros Mountains of Iran and the Turkish highlands. The closure of the Western Tethys produced the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Apennines, and the Atlas Ranges. All the great mountain systems that surround the Mediterranean and give it its dramatic topography are the direct result of the tectonic processes that also created the conditions for the Messinian salinity crisis. The closure of the Tethys also illustrates a general principle about why geological events often have multiple, interacting causes. The Mediterranean's isolation was not caused by a single tectonic event. It was the cumulative result of Africa's northward movement, the uplift of the Betic and Rif Cordilleras, and the specific geometry of the passages connecting the two basins. Remove any one of those factors and the Messinian salinity crisis might not have occurred, or might have occurred differently. Geological events are rarely simple cause and effect chains. They are usually convergences of multiple conditions, each of which is individually necessary but not sufficient. The closure of the Eastern Tethys, produced by Arabia's collision with Asia and India's with Asia, was a process completed gradually during the Eocene and Oligocene. As that closure advanced, the Western Tethys, the future Mediterranean, was progressively isolated from the Indian Ocean. By the Miocene, the Mediterranean's only connection to the world ocean was westward, toward the Atlantic. And that western connection was also threatened. The movement of Africa northward, which was closing the Eastern Tethys and raising the mountain chains of the Middle East and Central Asia, was also beginning to compress the region between Northern Africa and Southern Europe. The study of Miocene marine deposits from the Betic and Riffian corridors shows the progressive deterioration of marine conditions as connectivity with the Atlantic declined. Foraminifera, those marine microorganisms with carbonate shells extraordinarily useful as marine condition indicators, show changes in their communities reflecting worsening connectivity. First, the disappearance of species most sensitive to salinity changes, then dominance of extremophile species, finally the disappearance of all normal marine fauna. That ancestral ocean is called the Tethys Sea. We have mentioned it in other contexts as the ocean existing between the blocks of Gondwana and Laurasia when Pangaea began breaking apart, and later as the ocean closed by India's journey toward Asia. The Tethys was one of the richest and most extensive oceans in Earth's history, and during the Cretaceous it covered regions that today are dry land in Central Europe, in Northern Africa, and in what is now the Middle East. As tectonic plates continued moving during the Paleogene and Neogene, the Tethys progressively closed. Africa began approaching Europe. Arabia separated from Africa and advanced toward Asia, closing the eastern end of the Tethys and producing the foldings that would eventually form the mountains of Iran and the Alpine Arc. The Tethys Sea was reduced to the long western arm that we today call the Mediterranean, trapped between the southern edge of Europe and the northern coasts of Africa and Arabia. The modern Mediterranean is, in that sense, a dying ocean. It is the last remnant of a great ocean that was progressively consumed by plate movement. And that process of consumption has not ended. The Mediterranean continues closing, very slowly, as Africa continues moving northward. In tens of millions of years, the Mediterranean could close completely, producing a new mountain chain where today there is sea. The Mediterranean also inherited the Tethys's biodiversity. Many of the organism groups inhabiting the modern Mediterranean have ancestors that lived in the Tethys during the Cretaceous or Paleogene. The richness of the modern Mediterranean, despite the reductions produced by the Messinian event, is partly a legacy of hundreds of millions of years of marine evolution in the great tropical ocean of which the Mediterranean is the last fragment. The history of the Tethys is also written in the fauna of regions that today seem completely removed from the sea. Fossil sharks in the wheat fields of Spain, fossil coral reefs in the mountains of Italy, nummulites, those stone coins that are actually shells of giant foraminifera, which abound in the Egyptian pyramids because they were used as building material, all are vestiges of the Tethys in today's landscapes. The Tethys is everywhere in the Mediterranean and its surroundings. You just need to know how to look to see it. During the Miocene, the geological period lasting from approximately 23 million years ago until 5.5 million years ago, the Mediterranean was connected to the Atlantic through two marine passages. One ran through what is today southern Spain, the so-called Betic Corridor, crossing approximately through the present provinces of Murcia and Almeria. The other ran through what is today northern Morocco and northeastern Algeria, the so-called Riphean Corridor. The sedimentological studies of Betic Corridor deposits show that the passage depth was progressively decreasing from approximately 7 million years ago. The foraminifera show changes in their communities reflecting the connection's deterioration. First, the disappearance of species most sensitive to salinity changes, then the dominance of tolerant species, finally the disappearance of all normal marine fauna. The importance of the Betic and Riphean corridors for the Mediterranean's biological history extends beyond the immediate Messinian event. For millions of years before the corridors closed, those passages controlled the exchange of organisms between the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Species that could cross the corridors colonized both seas. Species that could not remain restricted to one or the other. The closure of the corridors not only cut off the water supply, it also cut off the biological exchange that had been occurring for millions of years, setting up the conditions for the biological divergence that the Messinian event then dramatically accelerated. The closure of the Betic and Riphean corridors also had consequences for the marine organisms that had been using those passages. Species that migrated regularly between the Atlantic and Mediterranean could no longer do so. Populations that had been continuously mixing genetically became isolated. The early stages of that genetic isolation, beginning perhaps 1 million years before the Messinian salinity crisis proper, are visible in some groups of marine organisms as a gradual divergence between Atlantic and Mediterranean populations that predates the crisis itself. The Riphean corridor closed before the Betic, and for a time the Betic corridor was the Mediterranean's only Atlantic connection. But the Betic was also becoming ever shallower, and finally also closed. The deposits marking that final closure are found in Almeria province in Spain and in the Rif Mountains in Morocco, perfectly visible in the field for any geologist who knows where to look. They are the scars of where the Mediterranean died for the first time. The final closure of the passages was probably not a single event. There could have been periods of partial reopening and definitive closure, related to sea level variations produced by glacial cycles already beginning to affect the planet in the late Miocene. During glacial periods, when sea level fell and the already shallow passages were exposed, the Mediterranean lost its Atlantic connection. During interglacials, when sea level rose, the connection could have been briefly re-established. Those opening and closing cycles would have produced cyclic variations in Mediterranean salinity recorded in the period's deposits. The tectonic complexity of the Gibraltar Arc, the region where Africa and Europe most closely approach, is extraordinary and still debated among geologists. The Gibraltar Arc is not simply a point where two continents touch. It is an oblique convergence zone where the African plate is being partially subducted under the Eurasian plate, with a subduction geometry retreating westward and producing the characteristic mountain arc, and the Alboran Basin occupying the western Mediterranean extreme. That dynamic geometry is what makes predicting how the Strait of Gibraltar will evolve in the future so difficult. Through those two passages, Atlantic water continuously entered the Mediterranean to compensate for evaporation. The Mediterranean is a sea that evaporates more water than it receives from its rivers. Without oceanic input, it would begin shrinking and increasing its salinity. With Atlantic input, it maintains equilibrium. The problem began approximately 6 million years ago. The African plate kept moving northward, and that movement produced tectonic uplift in the regions where Africa and Europe were approaching. That uplift began elevating the terrain in the corridors connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The marine passages that had been open for millions of years began becoming shallower. The currents that had previously circulated freely began encountering obstacles. The process was gradual, but its direction was clear. The Betic Cordilleras in southern Spain and the Rif Cordilleras in northern Morocco were rising, and by rising were strangling the passages through which the Atlantic fed the Mediterranean. The first signs of the problem appear in the Mediterranean sedimentary record approximately 6 million years ago, when Mediterranean water salinity began increasing and communities of marine organisms began changing in response to increasingly stressful conditions. The closure of the Betic Corridor was also an event that modified regional oceanic circulation in ways recorded in the sediments of the period. Before closure, Atlantic waters flowed freely toward the Mediterranean and Mediterranean waters toward the Atlantic, in a bidirectional exchange similar to what occurs today in the Strait of Gibraltar. With the corridor's closure, that exchange ceased, and the circulation pattern of the eastern Atlantic changed consequently. For several 100,000 years, the Mediterranean functioned as an increasingly salty sea with an increasingly restricted connection to the Atlantic. The currents that had previously circulated freely through the corridors became trickles barely compensating evaporation. And approximately 5,800,000 years ago, that connection was definitively severed. The last passages closed. The Mediterranean was isolated from the world ocean and began to evaporate. Imagine a sea the size of the Mediterranean, approximately 2.5 million square kilometers of surface, with an average depth of 1,500 meters, with no oceanic water input. The rivers discharging into it contribute fresh water, but that amount is completely insufficient to compensate for evaporation under the Mediterranean sun. The Mediterranean's water balance is significantly negative. It evaporates approximately 1 meter of water per year more than it receives from rivers. The dynamics of a sea losing its oceanic connection is well understood through modern analogies, though none reaches the Messinian-Mediterranean scale. The Dead Sea, on the Israel-Jordan-Palestine border, is a hypersaline lake without sea outlet that is shrinking because it evaporates more water than it receives from the rivers discharging into it. Its level has fallen more than 30 meters in the last century. The Aral Sea, which was the world's fourth largest lake, has lost more than 90% of its volume in 50 years due to the diversion of its feeding rivers. The chemistry of the evaporating Mediterranean also changed the distribution of different mineral types across the basin in ways that paleoceanographers can reconstruct from the spatial distribution of Messinian deposits. Carbonates dominated in the peripheral shallower zones. Gypsum dominated in the intermediate zones. Halite concentrated in the deepest central zones. That spatial zonation of evaporite minerals is a direct map of the salinity gradient that existed in the evaporating sea, with the most concentrated brines in the center and the more dilute waters at the margins where rivers brought fresh water. The modern Mediterranean's water balance, evaporating more than it receives from rivers, makes it a useful natural laboratory for studying concentrated marine environments. The eastern Mediterranean is already saltier than the western Mediterranean because it is further from the Atlantic input and receives less fresh water from rivers. The Red Sea, even more isolated and more evaporative, shows what the Mediterranean could become if its Atlantic connection weakens further. Those modern analogues, visible in today's geography, are windows into the Messinian past. But those modern examples are microscopic compared to the Mediterranean. The Dead Sea has a volume of barely 147 cubic kilometers. The Aral Sea in its current state has less than 70 cubic kilometers. The Mediterranean has 3,600,000 cubic kilometers. The scale is completely different, and so are the consequences. The rate at which the Mediterranean evaporated significantly is difficult to calculate precisely, depending on the evaporation rate, which varied with climate, and whether there were sporadic Atlantic water inputs during the process. The most used estimates suggest the most intense evaporite deposition phases, when salt and gypsum actively precipitated from concentrated water, lasted approximately 200,000 years. But the degradation of marine conditions began earlier, and complete recovery took time after the flood refilled the sea. The Mediterranean's evaporation rate can be used to estimate how long it would take to dry out if isolated from the Atlantic. The modern Mediterranean evaporates approximately 1 meter of water above what it receives from rivers. With a volume of 3,600,000 cubic kilometers and an average depth of 1,500 meters, the water residence time would be approximately 80 years without Atlantic input. In a few thousand years without that input, the Mediterranean would have lost most of its volume, and in tens of thousands of years it would have been reduced to the residual lakes of the deepest zones. With that deficit, and without Atlantic input, the Mediterranean level began falling. Not rapidly, not as if someone had opened a drain, but constantly. Year after year, century after century, the water level dropped. And as it dropped, the remaining water concentrated. The salt that rivers brought and that before was diluted in an immense volume of seawater began accumulating. Mediterranean salinity increased. Marine organisms began dying. Species adapted to normal salinity, similar to that of the ocean, could not survive in the increasingly extreme conditions of the evaporating Mediterranean. The communities of reefs, marine fish, cephalopods, and crustaceans that had populated the Mediterranean for millions of years began disappearing. The sea that had been one of the biologically richest of the Miocene period was becoming a hostile environment that only the most salt-tolerant organisms could inhabit. As the level dropped and salinity increased, the Mediterranean began behaving like a large salt lake, similar to today's Dead Sea but on an incomparably larger scale. At those conditions, water is no longer an environment where most organisms can live. It is almost a brine. When salt concentration exceeds certain thresholds, salt begins precipitating directly from the water. First the carbonates, then gypsum, then halite, which is common table salt. Those minerals deposit on the floor of the drying sea, building layers of evaporitic rock that can be several meters thick. And those layers are what today, buried under the modern Mediterranean, tell the story of what happened. The variability of Mediterranean salinity during the Messinian salinity crisis, produced by glacial cycles alternating periods of corridor opening and closure, is one of the most complex aspects of the event. That cyclicity is preserved in the alternation of layers of different evaporite types in Messinian deposits, where periods of greater evaporation correspond to layers of more concentrated minerals and periods of lesser evaporation correspond to layers of less concentrated minerals or impoverished marine sediments. At the moment of maximum evaporation, The Mediterranean was a place of a strangeness that is difficult to imagine. Not a dry desert without life like the Sahara. Something stranger, a basin of extreme depth, more than 3 kilometers below sea level at its deepest, with brine lakes at the lowest points, surrounded by vertical cliffs of hundreds or thousands of meters height that were the former coastlines of Europe and Africa, now elevated far above the basin floor like the walls of a bottomless canyon. The atmospheric pressure at the dry Mediterranean floor would have been significantly greater than at sea level, with physical effects on both the environment and any organisms attempting to inhabit that extreme depression. The greater pressure raises the boiling point of water, allows water to exist at higher temperatures without becoming vapor, and has physiological effects on air-breathing vertebrates that might venture to the basin floor. The paleoclimate of the dry Mediterranean basin, to the extent it can be reconstructed from geological evidence, would have been among the most extreme of any terrestrial environment on Earth in the last 10 million years. The combination of 3 kilometers below sea level, high atmospheric pressure, extreme temperatures, and extremely arid conditions would have created a climate unlike anything in the modern world. The closest modern analogy might be Death Valley in California combined with the hypersaline conditions of the Dead Sea, but even that combination falls far short of capturing the full strangeness of the Messinian Basin at its most extreme. The geological record also preserves evidence of the atmospheric consequences of Mediterranean evaporation. Dust layers in sediment cores from the Atlantic and from continental Europe show elevated concentrations of North African dust during the Messinian period, consistent with an expanded and more active Saharan dust system in the context of regional aridification. Salt crystals have also been found in Messinian-aged ice cores and sediment records from distant locations, transported by wind from the evaporating Mediterranean basin across Europe and possibly beyond. The water falling as rain over the dry Mediterranean basin would also have behaved unusually. Descending from the surrounding plateaus and cliffs to the basin floor, the air compresses and warms, in the same process producing the Fein effect in the modern Alps. A storm producing abundant rain on the European plateaus could have produced hot, dry air on reaching the Messinian basin floor, because the rain evaporated before reaching the ground in the basin's extremely hot and dry atmosphere. Convective currents in the basin would have been equally unusual. The extreme heat of the basin floor would have produced rising warm air that on meeting the cooler air from surrounding plateaus could have generated storms of extraordinary violence at basin edges, while the interior remained scorching and rainless. The evaporite sediments deposited on the dry Mediterranean floor contain information about astronomical cycles controlling the climate during that period. The Milankovitch cycles left their mark on Messinian deposits in cyclic alternations of different evaporite types. The analysis of those alternations allows geologists to calibrate Messinian chronology with precision not possible through radiometric methods alone. The water of the evaporating Mediterranean would also have experienced color changes. Normal ocean water is blue because it absorbs red and orange light wavelengths and reflects blue ones. But hypersaline water, especially when hosting carotenoid-producing halophilic bacterial communities, can acquire red, pink, or orange colors. The Mediterranean in its final evaporation phases, with extreme salinity waters and halophilic microbial communities, could have had colors nothing like the Mediterranean blue we associate with that sea. The heat at the basin floor would be extreme. Basins far below sea level tend to be hotter than the surface because air descends by gravity and compresses, warming in the process. Death Valley in California, barely 80 meters below sea level, reaches temperatures of nearly 60 degrees in summer. The dry Mediterranean floor, 3 kilometers below sea level, would have had even more extreme temperatures, possibly exceeding 70 or 80 degrees during the hottest periods. Under those conditions, evaporation would have been even more intense, accelerating mineral precipitation. The Mediterranean basin floor would have been covered by successive layers of different minerals in the order in which they precipitate as salt concentration increases. First, the carbonates, precipitating when concentration reaches approximately 30% of the original water. then gypsum, precipitating when about 20% remains, then halite, when about 10% remains. The Messinian Basin's atmospheric pressure would also have been significantly greater than at sea level. The atmosphere is a fluid exerting pressure proportional to the height of the air column above. At 3 kilometers below sea level, atmospheric pressure would have been significantly higher than at the surface. That greater pressure has physical effects. It raises the boiling point of water, allowing liquid water to exist at higher temperatures before becoming steam. The evaporite sediments that deposited in the dry Mediterranean floor also contain information about astronomical cycles that controlled the climate during that period. The Milankovitch cycles, the periodic variations in Earth's orbit and rotation axis that produce glacial and interglacial cycles, left their mark on Messinian deposits in the form of cyclic alternations of different evaporite types. Analyzing those alternations allows geologists to calibrate Messinian chronology with precision not possible by radiometric methods alone. The landscape of the dry Mediterranean would have been a series of concentric zones, with the most concentrated brine lakes at the lowest points and the thickest evaporite deposits surrounding them. Peripheral zones, higher up, could have had lakes of lesser salinity where rain and rivers provided fresh water that partially diluted the brine. And at the highest basin edges, where continental waters arrived before evaporating, small communities of extremophile organisms might have survived at the limit conditions. Despite the extreme conditions, life did not completely disappear from the Mediterranean during its evaporation period. Life has an extraordinary capacity to adapt to limit conditions, and in the most favorable environments of the dry Mediterranean basin, extremophile organisms found ways to survive. The experience of organisms living in the Mediterranean during its evaporation, to the extent we can reconstruct it, was one of a world changing faster than evolution could follow. Marine species that in normal conditions had millions of years to adapt to environmental changes now found themselves in an environment deteriorating on timescales of thousands of years. The organisms could not adapt evolutionarily. They could only die or survive with the traits they already had. The biogeography of Mediterranean island endemic species provides some of the clearest evidence of the Messinian event's biological consequences. Islands like Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearics have endemic species, plants and animals found nowhere else, that diverged from their ancestors in isolation. The timing of those divergences, calculated from DNA differences and calibrated molecular clocks, in many cases points to the period immediately following the Zanclean flood, when rising sea levels progressively isolated island populations from mainland relatives. The Messinian event thus shaped Mediterranean biodiversity not only by destroying the pre-Messinian fauna but also by creating the isolation conditions that generated the island endemic species we value so highly today. The Messinian event's biological legacy also extends to the genetic diversity of Mediterranean sea creatures. The genetic bottleneck produced by the near-complete destruction of Mediterranean marine fauna during the evaporation phase, followed by the recolonization from a relatively small number of Atlantic source populations, should be detectable as reduced genetic diversity in Mediterranean species compared to their Atlantic relatives. Genetic studies of several Mediterranean species have confirmed that pattern, providing molecular evidence for the population bottleneck that the Messinian event imposed on the ancestors of modern Mediterranean marine life. The Messinian microbialites found in some period deposits are of special scientific interest because they represent a type of ecosystem organization absent from most modern marine environments precisely because grazing animals consume microbial films before they can develop. Their presence in Messinian deposits is a direct signal that the environments hosting them had become so extreme that those grazing animals could not survive there, allowing microbial communities to develop in ways reminiscent of the Precambrian. The freshwater fish biogeography of Mediterranean rivers is one of the most instructive biological consequences of the crisis. The river communities of the Ebro, the Rhone, the Pa, the Tiber, the Nile, all carry in their genetic histories the marks of what happened 5 million years ago. populations today separated in different island or river basin locations show divergence times in their DNA corresponding to the Messinian period, providing a molecular archive of geological history invisible on the surface but written in the genes of every freshwater fish in a Mediterranean river. The Messinian event also reset the connectivity between European and African river fish communities. When the Mediterranean dried, rivers from both continents could in principle reach the basin's peripheral zones. Fish communities that had been separated by the sea for millions of years could potentially mix in freshwater environments within the basin margins. And when the Mediterranean refilled and the sea separated them again, those mixed communities began differentiating anew, producing the complex patterns of genetic variation seen today in Mediterranean freshwater fish. Halophilic bacteria, organisms adapted to extreme salt concentrations, are the primary candidates to have inhabited the Messinian brine lakes. Those bacteria exist today in the Dead Sea, in African salt lakes, and in other hypersaline environments. They are organisms that have developed biochemical mechanisms to function in conditions where the osmotic pressure of the environment would extract water from any normal cell. Some produce carotenoid pigments of red or pink color that tint the salt lakes they inhabit, and could have colored the last Messinian Mediterranean lagoons with striking hues. Brine shrimp, small crustaceans about a centimeter long found today in salt flats worldwide and known popularly as sea monkeys, are organisms extremely tolerant of salt that could have inhabited the evaporating Mediterranean lagoons. Brine shrimp produce resistant cysts that can survive completely desiccated for years or decades, making them capable of rapidly repopulating saline environments whenever conditions allow. Microbialites, structures built by microbial communities similar to Precambrian stromatolites, have been identified in some Messinian period deposits, suggesting that relatively complex microbial communities survived in the extreme conditions of the evaporating Mediterranean. The biogeography of modern Mediterranean organisms carries the marks of the Messinian salinity crisis in ways that marine biologists have been revealing over recent decades. If the pre-crisis Mediterranean fauna was almost completely destroyed by evaporation, and the current fauna derives from post-Messinian recolonization from the Atlantic, then there should be systematic differences between Mediterranean and Atlantic fauna reflecting the 5 million years of separation and differentiation. And those differences exist. Many species of Mediterranean fish and invertebrates have close Atlantic relatives with whom they share a common ancestor living approximately 5 million years ago, at the time of recolonization. The divergence time of those species, calculated from their DNA change rate, coincides remarkably with the date of Gibraltar Strait opening and Mediterranean filling. The freshwater fish of Mediterranean rivers also carry Messinian history. The river species that today inhabit the Ebro, the Rhone, the Pa, the Tiber, the Nile, all have in their distribution and evolutionary history the marks of what happened 5 million years ago, when the Mediterranean dried and then filled again, creating barriers and corridors that forever shaped the distribution of aquatic life in the region. The most direct and most spectacular evidence of what occurred during the Messinian salinity crisis is not organism fossils but rocks. The salt and gypsum deposits that formed during Mediterranean evaporation are visible today in many places in the regions surrounding the ancient sea, and under the modern seafloor they reach thicknesses of several kilometers. The amount of salt deposited in the Mediterranean floor during the Messinian salinity crisis is one of the event's most astonishing data points. The most used estimates suggest approximately 1 million cubic kilometers of evaporites were deposited, an amount far exceeding any other known evaporite deposit in the Phanerozoic geological record. The Messinian deposits preserved in rocks throughout the Mediterranean region are not merely geological curiosities. They are also economic resources that have been exploited since the earliest human civilizations. The Romans quarried gypsum from Sicilian Messinian deposits to plaster their buildings. Medieval Europeans mined salt from Messinian deposits in Spain and Italy for food preservation. Modern industry extracts potash and other minerals from Messinian formations for use as fertilizers. The practical human uses of Messinian evaporites connect the deep geological past to everyday contemporary life in ways that are rarely appreciated. The thickness of Messinian evaporite deposits also varies dramatically from one part of the basin to another, recording the uneven geography of the drying sea. In the deepest parts of the western Mediterranean, the evaporite sequence is thickest, sometimes exceeding 3 kilometers. In shallower peripheral zones, the sequence is thinner or absent. That thickness variation maps the topography of the Messinian basin, with the deepest zones accumulating the most material as their waters concentrated most intensely and the salt layers built up over thousands of years of evaporation. To visualize that quantity, if all that salt were distributed over Spain's surface, it would form a layer several kilometers thick. If distributed uniformly over the entire planet's land surface, it would form a layer several meters thick. It is a quantity of geological material genuinely difficult to mentally represent. That enormous amount of salt also had consequences for world ocean chemistry. The salt deposited in the Mediterranean was extracted from ocean water. The rivers discharging into the Mediterranean, previously contributing their dissolved salt loads to the global salt balance, stopped contributing that salt to the ocean when the Mediterranean was isolated. The global ocean was slightly impoverished in sodium chloride during the period of maximum Mediterranean deposition. The Messinian evaporite deposits also have economic importance. The Messinian gypsum outcropping in Sicily, Spain, Greece, and other Mediterranean regions has been exploited since antiquity for construction and plaster manufacturing. The Messinian gypsum quarries in Sicily are among the world's oldest, and the material they extract is literally the salt of the dried Mediterranean from 5 million years ago. The Messinian deposits are also relevant to the oil and gas industry, because salt acts as an efficient trap for hydrocarbons. Salt, flowing plastically under the pressure of overlying sediments and forming domes and diapirs, creates structural traps of that type. Oil and gas fields in northern Africa and the eastern Mediterranean are partly related to Messinian deposit geometry and the traps that salt movement has created. The Sicilian Alps are one of the world's best places to see those deposits. In many localities of Sicily and southern Italy, outcrops of Messinian gypsum, the gypsum that formed on the floor of the evaporating Mediterranean, are exposed at the surface and can be studied directly. Those outcrops show successive layers of gypsum of different textures, from fine laminated gypsum formed in calm waters to large crystal gypsum indicating slower precipitation in more stable environments. In Spain, Messinian gypsum and salt deposits outcrop in Almeria province and other parts of the southeastern peninsula. The Almeria region is today one of Europe's most arid landscapes, an almost vegetation-free desert that contrasts dramatically with the rest of the peninsula. That aridity has partly geological roots. The region's soils are rich in Messinian salt and gypsum, which inhibits vegetation growth. The deep ocean drilling campaigns conducted from the 1970s revealed something extraordinary. Under the normal marine sediments covering the Mediterranean floor lies a layer of salt and gypsum up to 3 kilometers thick in some basin parts. That layer, first identified in deep ocean drilling project boreholes in 1970, was the first irrefutable evidence that the Mediterranean had experienced near-complete evaporation. The amount of salt contained in those deposits is so large that if distributed uniformly over the entire modern Mediterranean surface, it would form a layer several hundred meters thick. The minerals of Messinian evaporites also contain information about the temperature and composition of the water in which they formed, accessible through fluid inclusions. Fluid inclusions are small liquid droplets trapped in crystals when they form, preserving a sample of the parent water. Analyzing those inclusions, geochemists can reconstruct conditions of the evaporating Mediterranean water with precision not possible through any other method. Those Messinian evaporite deposits are also an important reason why the Mediterranean has some of the most interesting geophysical anomalies in the world oceanic realm. Salt, with its low density and plastic behavior under pressure, tends to flow and form structures called salt diapirs that deform the sediment layers above them. Mediterranean salt diapirs, many still active, are direct legacies of the Messinian salinity crisis. One of the most dramatic and most beautiful consequences of Mediterranean evaporation was what happened to the rivers. The great rivers of southern Europe, the Nile in Africa, the Rhone in France, the Ebro in Spain, the Pa in Italy, all discharge into the Mediterranean. When the Mediterranean level began falling, those rivers had to adjust their longitudinal profiles to the new base level. Rivers carve their valleys in function of the lowest point they can reach, which is sea level or the level of the lake or sea into which they discharge. When that base level falls, rivers carve their valleys more deeply to accommodate the new level. The Messinian canyons of the Nile and the Rhone are also relevant for understanding the modern geology of regions of strategic importance. The Messinian Nile Canyon, buried under Egypt's Nile Delta, is an enormous structure lying under several delta cities, including parts of Cairo and Alexandria. Knowledge of its existence and geometry is important for infrastructure planning in that densely populated region. The discovery and mapping of the buried Messinian canyons also changed how geologists understand the process of continental shelf formation. The Messinian incision, when rivers cut deep canyons in continental margins during the evaporation phase, created a complex topography that was subsequently filled in by sediment as the sea rose after the Zanclean flood. That buried topography continues to influence the distribution of sediments and the behavior of submarine landslides in the modern Mediterranean, making the Messinian history relevant not just for understanding the past but for predicting geological hazards in the present. The Rhone Messinian Canyon identification also had practical consequences. When in the 1950s and 60s the Marcoule nuclear power plant in southern France was being planned, engineers performing subsurface surveys revealed the presence of a deep incision in the rock under the modern Rhone bed, consistent with a Messinian canyon's presence. That incision modified the plant's foundation design, which had to be anchored deeper than expected to ensure stability over the ancient canyon's sediment fill. The Messinian canyons are also a striking example of the geological memory of landscapes. The modern Rhone Valley in France, a wide, gentle valley formed by glacial and fluvial erosion of the last few million years, represents a depression in the topography approximately following the buried Messinian canyon below. Modern rivers tend to follow pre-existing terrain depressions, and the modern Rhone unconsciously follows its Messinian ancestors' course, which carved a canyon of kilometers depth at the margins of the empty Mediterranean. The significance of these buried canyons extends beyond scientific curiosity. They represent genuine geological hazards for infrastructure construction in coastal regions, affect the distribution of groundwater, and create unexpected subsurface conditions for engineering projects. Understanding the Messinian history is thus not just academic. It has direct practical applications for the millions of people living in Mediterranean coastal cities built above these geological features. The Nile is the most studied and most dramatic example. The modern Nile discharges into the Mediterranean through the Nile Delta in Egypt. But during the Messinian salinity crisis, when the Mediterranean was 3 kilometers lower than today, the Nile had to descend those additional 3 kilometers to reach the ancient sea level. To do so, it carved a canyon in the rock of northern Egypt that, according to seismic studies of the modern seafloor, was as deep and as narrow as the Grand Canyon or deeper. That Messinian Nile Canyon lies today buried under the Nile Delta, covered by the sediments the river has deposited in the last 5 million years since the Mediterranean refilled. Geologists discovered it when analysis of seismic wave propagation speeds through the delta subsurface revealed the presence of a solid rock structure at great depth with the unmistakable form of a river canyon. The Rhone also carved its own canyon during the Messinian salinity crisis, a canyon descending from the current Mediterranean level to the basin floor several kilometers below. That canyon, equally buried under the modern Rhone Delta sediments, was identified when a borehole for a nuclear power plant construction in the French coast revealed the presence of undisturbed rock far deeper than expected, at a position consistent with an ancient river canyon. The history of how Messinian canyons were scientifically discovered is also fascinating. The geophysicists analyzing seismic reflection data of the Rhone continental margin in the 1960s noted anomalies they could not explain with existing geological models. Only when the Messinian salinity crisis was identified as such in 1970 from Glomar Challenger boreholes could those anomalies be correctly interpreted as fills of river canyons carved during Mediterranean evaporation. Those Messinian canyons, carved by the great European and African rivers at the edge of a nearly empty Mediterranean, are some of the most spectacular geological structures in existence, though completely hidden under the sea and under delta sediments. They are the silent testimony of a time when European and African rivers literally fell into a void at the edges of a gigantic salt pit. The world surrounding the dry Mediterranean during the Messinian salinity crisis was radically different from the modern world. Not only because the Mediterranean did not exist as a sea, but because Mediterranean evaporation had climatic and geographical consequences that transformed the entire surrounding region. The landscape of southern Europe and northern Africa during the Messinian salinity crisis had climatic characteristics radically differentiating it from the present. The absence of the Mediterranean as a moisture source would have affected the precipitation regime of the entire region, and climate models simulating the Messinian situation produce a northern Africa and southern Europe more arid than current ones. The connection between the Messinian salinity crisis and the history of African desertification is one of the more speculative but intriguing aspects of the event. The Sahara's current desert climate is not a permanent feature of northern Africa. Geological and paleoclimatological evidence shows that the Sahara was green and wet during the African humid period of 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. That green Sahara coincided with a period when summer solar radiation was higher due to orbital variations, driving stronger monsoons into northern Africa. The late Miocene, when the Mediterranean was evaporating, may also have been a period of particularly dry conditions in northern Africa, setting the stage for early Saharan expansion in the context of overall Neogene aridification. The timing of the Mediterranean's maximum drying, approximately 5.5 million years ago, also coincides with a significant global cooling event that marked the beginning of the Pliocene. That cooling contributed to the expansion of Antarctic ice sheets and to changes in ocean circulation that affected climates worldwide. The relationship between Mediterranean evaporation and global climate change during this period is complex and still being worked out, but it is clear that the Messinian event was not an isolated regional phenomenon. It was embedded in a global climate transition of which it was both a product and a contributor. That greater aridity could be related to the Sahara's expansion during the late Miocene. The Sahara is not an ancient desert in the sense of having always existed as we know it today. Saharan desertification was a gradual process beginning in the late Miocene and having periods of greater and lesser extent throughout the Plio-Pleistocene. The absence of the Mediterranean as a moisture source during the Messinian could have accelerated that desertification. The pollen studies of late Miocene deposits in Mediterranean regions show a notable reduction in forests and an increase in steppe or semi-arid type vegetation during the Messinian salinity crisis period. That pollen signal is another of the indirect evidences of Mediterranean evaporation's impact on regional climate. The paleoclimate studies of the Mediterranean use multiple proxies, indirect indicators of past climatic conditions, to reconstruct how the region's climate has changed since the Messinian. Oxygen isotopes in foraminifera shells reflect water temperature. Different pollen types in sediments reflect the surrounding catchment's vegetation. The composition of planktonic organisms reflects surface water temperature, salinity, and productivity. Combining those different proxies, paleoceanographers can reconstruct a detailed history of Mediterranean climate from the early Pliocene to the present, including Pleistocene glaciation's effects on the sea. The glaciers of mountains surrounding the Mediterranean basin would also have responded to drier conditions. With less available moisture, the Alps, Pyrenees, and Atlas glaciers would have been smaller or retreated during the period of greatest aridity associated with Mediterranean evaporation. The lesser ice load on those mountain chains would have had effects on isostasy, the equilibrium between mountain weight and mantle push, producing adjustments in Cordillera elevation that would have modified precipitation and erosion patterns. Southern Europe and Northern Africa were regions with a climate different from today's. The late Miocene was globally warmer than the Pleistocene that would follow, and the modern Mediterranean has a stabilizing effect on the climate of the surrounding regions. It moderates winters, humidifies summers, and generally makes the Mediterranean climate milder than it would be without the sea. Without the Mediterranean, the region would have had a more continental and more extreme climate, with colder winters and drier summers. The coasts surrounding the dry Mediterranean basin were cliffs of impressive proportions. The current Mediterranean coastlines are mostly beaches, coves, and coastal plains, the result of millions of years of sediment deposition on a stable coastal margin. But during the Messinian salinity crisis, when sea level was 3 kilometers lower, those current coastal zones were the edge of an enormous precipice descending toward the dried basin floor. The Pyrenees, the Alps, the Apennines, the Atlas, all those mountain chains fell directly toward the Mediterranean pit floor with no coastal plain to soften the transition. Animals from Europe and Africa could walk where before there had been sea. The dry Mediterranean floor, though extremely inhospitable in the deepest and hottest central zones, could have been passable in the higher peripheral zones. And the European and African coasts, previously separated by hundreds of kilometers of sea, were now joined by the basin floor. That created an opportunity for faunal exchange between Europe and Africa on a scale not previously possible during the Neogene. The pollen studies of late Miocene deposits in Mediterranean regions show a notable reduction in forests and an increase in steppe or semi-arid type vegetation during the period corresponding to the Messinian salinity crisis. That pollen signal is another of the indirect evidences of the impact that Mediterranean evaporation had on regional climate. The glaciers of the mountains surrounding the Mediterranean basin would also have responded to the drier conditions, being smaller or having retreated during the period of greatest aridity associated with Mediterranean evaporation. The late Miocene mammal fauna of Europe and Africa is fascinating in itself, but the Messinian salinity crisis provides an extraordinary context for understanding the distribution of those animals and the connections between the faunas of the two continents. The primate fauna of the late Miocene Mediterranean region is especially interesting in the context of the Messinian salinity crisis, because that period coincides approximately with some of the most important divergences in hominid evolutionary history. The evidence for faunal exchange across the dry Messinian Mediterranean is still being actively researched and debated. Some paleontologists argue the evidence for significant land connections between Europe and Africa during the Messinian is strong, pointing to the presence of African mammal genera in European early Pliocene deposits. Others argue the exchanges were modest and could have occurred through other routes not requiring complete Mediterranean drying. The debate illustrates the complexity of interpreting the paleontological record. Species distributions can change for many reasons, and distinguishing Messinian land bridges from other dispersal mechanisms requires careful analysis of the timing and direction of faunal movements. The late Miocene hominid fauna of Africa also includes some of the earliest known species in our own lineage. The fossil record of that period in East Africa is rich with species of Australopithecus and related genera that were experimenting with bipedal locomotion, using stone tools, and developing larger brains. Those early hominids lived in a world where the Mediterranean was either absent or in the process of refilling, where Africa's climate was being reshaped by the loss and return of a major moisture source, and where the connections between African and European ecosystems were temporarily transformed. The context of those early human ancestors was geological as well as biological. The late Miocene was a period of extraordinary primate diversity in Europe, Africa, and Asia. In Europe existed several hominid genera, primates related to modern great apes, known primarily from their dental and mandibular fossils. Those European Miocene hominids were part of a more diverse fauna than today's, when the only European hominids are modern humans. The disappearance of those European primates in the Pliocene, just after the Messinian period, could be related to the environmental changes produced by the Messinian salinity crisis and its resolution. The DNA studies of African great apes have allowed estimating with greater precision the divergence dates between different hominid lineages. Those estimates, combined with increasingly complete fossil records from Eastern Africa and other regions, reveal that the period of greatest evolutionary dynamism in the human lineage coincides approximately with the period of greatest climatic and geographical instability characterizing the late Miocene and early Pliocene. The Messinian salinity crisis was not necessarily a direct driver of human evolution, but formed part of the environmental perturbation context of that critical period. The genetic diversity studies of Mediterranean freshwater fish, amphibians, and other organisms have provided increasingly precise timelines for when populations in different river basins or islands were separated from each other. Those timelines, calibrated with molecular clocks and checked against the geological record, allow testing specific hypotheses about how the Messinian crisis affected the distribution of life in the region. The convergence between genetic evidence and geological evidence, each determined by completely independent methods, provides some of the strongest support for the overall reconstruction of the Messinian salinity crisis's biological effects. Late Miocene Europe was inhabited by a variety of mammals we would partly recognize and partly find completely strange. Mastodons, ancestors of modern elephants but with significant differences in tusk and molar form, were common animals in Europe and Africa during the Miocene. Hipparions, three-toed horses smaller than modern horses, grazed on southern European plains. Primitive giraffids, much less specialized than modern giraffes and with considerably shorter necks, fed on the shrubby vegetation of the Mediterranean. In Africa, the late Miocene fauna included ancestors of many of the large mammals we today associate with the continent. Ancestors of bovines and antelopes, ancestors of rhinoceroses, and the first representatives of the lineage that would eventually produce hominids, including human ancestors. It is in the late Miocene that the divergence between the lineage leading to chimpanzees and the lineage leading to humans is situated, a divergence occurring approximately in the same period as the Messinian salinity crisis. The genetic studies of African great apes have allowed estimating with greater precision the divergence dates between different hominid lineages. Those estimates, combined with increasingly complete fossil records from Eastern Africa and other regions, are revealing that the period of greatest evolutionary dynamism in the human lineage coincides approximately with the period of greatest climatic and geographical instability in Africa and the Mediterranean, characterizing the end of the Miocene and the beginning of the Pliocene. The Messinian salinity crisis was not necessarily a direct driver of human evolution, but it formed part of the environmental perturbation context characterizing that critical period. The distribution of amphibians in the Mediterranean region also carries Messinian salinity crisis marks. The newts, salamanders, and toads of the Mediterranean have distributions that in many cases can only be explained by the changes in habitat connectivity that the Messinian event produced. Populations today separated on different Mediterranean islands or in different river basins show in their genetics the separation times corresponding to the Messinian period and the early Pliocene, providing a molecular archive of the period's geological history. The most dramatic part of the entire Mediterranean story was not the evaporation. It was what came after: the return of the water. During the approximately 200,000 years that the greatest Mediterranean evaporation phase lasted, the barrier separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean basin was neither solid nor impermeable. It was a strip of elevated terrain, the result of tectonic uplifts, but water never stopped filtering through it, seeking its paths. And the tectonic movements that had elevated that barrier did not stop. The plates kept moving, and that movement, which had closed the passages, could also reopen them. The most dramatic part of the entire Mediterranean story was not the evaporation. It was what came after: the return of the water. And the mechanism of that return, the progressive erosion of a barrier by water falling toward an empty basin, is one of the most powerful geological processes the Earth has demonstrated in its recent history. The Zanclean flood's legacy is also visible in the sediment architecture of the modern Mediterranean floor. The turbidite deposits, the sediment layers produced by turbidity currents triggered by the flood's violent energy, can be identified in seismic profiles as distinctive sediment bodies at the base of the Pliocene sequence. Those deposits, thickest near the ancient flow paths and thinning away from them, are the physical record of the energy liberated during the greatest flood in recent geological history. Reading that record requires understanding the event that produced it, and understanding the event requires reading the record, a scientific dialogue between observation and interpretation that spans 5 million years of geological time. The moment of the first Atlantic water crossing the barrier into the dry Mediterranean is one of those geological moments that deserves particular contemplation. Before that moment, the Mediterranean had been dry for thousands of years, its floor baking under extreme heat, its salt deposits accumulating in silence. And then, in some exact instant that we can never precisely date, the first drop of Atlantic seawater crossed the threshold and began its journey downward toward the basin floor 3 kilometers below. That first drop was the beginning of the end of the drying, the first moment of the reborn sea. The geological concept of positive feedback, where a process accelerates itself once started, is central to understanding the Zanclean flood. The erosion of the barrier accelerated the flow, which accelerated the erosion, in a runaway process with no natural break until the Mediterranean was full and the height difference between Atlantic and Mediterranean was eliminated. That kind of positive feedback is also visible in other Earth system processes, from glacier formation to tropical forest loss, and understanding it in the geological context of the Zanclean flood helps calibrate our sense of how quickly such processes can transform large systems once they pass critical thresholds. During the approximately 200,000 years that the greatest Mediterranean evaporation phase lasted, the barrier separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean basin was neither solid nor impermeable. Water never stopped filtering through it, seeking its paths. And the tectonic movements that had elevated that barrier did not stop. The plates kept moving, and that movement, which had closed the passages, could also reopen them. The tsunamis that the Zanclean flood would have generated are another fascinating aspect of the event. When Atlantic water began falling toward the dry Mediterranean floor, the impact would have produced waves propagating from the impact point toward all Mediterranean coasts. In the flood's most intense phases, those waves would have had dimensions no modern tsunami can match. The basin edges, already kilometer-high cliffs, would have received the flood waves and reflected and amplified those waves in ways difficult to model with available data. The numerical models of Mediterranean filling are one of the most powerful tools for understanding the Zanclean flood's dynamics. Those models combine the Mediterranean basin's geometry, water and rock's physical properties, and fluid dynamics equations to simulate how filling would have occurred under different assumptions about passage opening. The most sophisticated models produce simulations in which filling is very rapid, of months to a few centuries, and in which input channel erosion is the limiting factor controlling the process's speed. The seismic structures potentially representing the flood's physical signature have been identified in several Mediterranean locations. If those structures were produced by the rapid Mediterranean filling, they are the physical signature of the greatest flood of the last few million years, written in rock on the seafloor and waiting to be read by future researchers with ever-improving technologies. Approximately 5,300,000 years ago, something changed. The terrain separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean subsided, or was eroded by Atlantic currents until Atlantic water could cross. The exact moment and precise mechanism by which that opening occurred are still debated. Some researchers argue it was gradual tectonic subsidence that allowed Atlantic water to begin crossing slowly. Others argue it was progressive erosion that at some point reached the threshold where Atlantic water, at sea level and therefore several kilometers above the dry Mediterranean floor, could flow freely. What is clear is what happened next. Once Atlantic water began crossing the barrier, even as a small stream, the situation became autocatalytic. Water crossing eroded the barrier, making the passage wider and deeper. A wider and deeper passage let through more water. More water eroded the barrier more rapidly. The passage became ever larger every hour that passed, and the amount of crossing water increased exponentially. The difference in level between the Atlantic and the dry Mediterranean floor was of several kilometers. When the passage became wide enough, Atlantic water did not simply flow toward the Mediterranean. It fell toward it. In a cascade of incomprehensible proportions, ocean water plunged through the opening passage toward the empty basin kilometers below. The energy of that fall eroded the passage rock, making it wider and deeper with every passing second. The reconstruction of the Zanclean flood has also generated debates about the validity of geological analogies. The use of the Black Sea filling as an analogy for the Zanclean flood has been criticized because the scale of the two events is completely different. The Black Sea has a volume of approximately 535 cubic kilometers. The Mediterranean has 3,600,000. The physical processes governing the filling of a basin of that scale could be qualitatively different from those governing the filling of a much smaller basin. That scale difference is one of the reasons why numerical models of the Zanclean flood remain a research priority. The Messinian flood, as some researchers have called it, was the greatest water transport event the Earth has produced in millions of years. To understand its scale, comparing it with other large waterfalls and water flows we know helps. The comparison of the Zanclean flood with other large water flow events in Earth's history helps situate its scale in perspective. One of the largest water flow events we have evidence for is the drainage of the great glacial lakes of North America at the end of the last glaciation, approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago. Lakes Agassiz and Ojibwe, meltwater lakes accumulated during glacier retreat, drained toward the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence system. Those events produced fresh water flows to the North Atlantic of sufficient magnitude to significantly alter global oceanic circulation and produce the cooling period known as the Younger Dryas. The Zanclean flood also illustrates a broader principle about geological catastrophes, that they can be both instantaneous in geological terms and enormously consequential in their effects. We tend to think of catastrophic events as requiring enormous external energy inputs, like asteroid impacts. But the Zanclean flood demonstrates that internally available gravitational potential energy, water at sea level wanting to flow toward a basin 3 kilometers below, is sufficient to produce geological catastrophes of the first order. The energy was always there, stored in the height difference between the Atlantic and the dry Mediterranean floor. It just needed a small breach in the barrier to be released, and once released, it did the rest. The question of whether the Zanclean flood was witnessed by any hominid ancestors is one that the timing of the event makes tantalizingly uncertain. The flood occurred approximately 5,300,000 years ago. The earliest known hominids, the ancestors of the human lineage, lived in Africa during that period. Whether any of them could perceive or in any way experience the enormous distant roaring and ground vibrations of the Zanclean flood is impossible to know. But they were alive at the same time, separated by only the Mediterranean itself from one of the greatest geological events of their era. The flows associated with the Zanclean flood would have been incomparably larger. The Mediterranean contains 3,600,000 cubic kilometers of water, while the great North American glacial lakes contained perhaps a tenth of that amount. And the Mediterranean had to fill, not empty, meaning water had to arrive from the Atlantic, driven by the height difference between Atlantic level and the dry Mediterranean floor. The Zanclean flood's effects on global oceanic circulation are also research subjects. Mediterranean filling would have produced a significant change in North Atlantic circulation because the modern Mediterranean has an important role in that circulation. It expels salty dense water toward the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, contributing to the thermohaline circulation distributing heat in the North Atlantic. Before the Mediterranean existed in its current form, that contribution did not exist, and Atlantic circulation would have been somewhat different. The energy liberated during the Zanclean flood was of extraordinary magnitude. Water falling several kilometers from Atlantic level toward the dry Mediterranean floor converted gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy and then into heat and erosion energy. That energy heated water locally at the impact point, produced steam, and eroded the channel bed with efficiency no modern river or waterfall can match. The most detailed models of the Zanclean flood suggest the input channel erosion rate was of several meters per hour during the flood's most intense phases. Niagara Falls transports approximately 5,600 cubic meters of water per second. Iguazu Falls, on the Argentine-Brazilian border, transport approximately 12,000 cubic meters per second under normal conditions. The Amazon River, the world's largest by water volume, discharges into the Atlantic Ocean approximately 200,000 cubic meters per second. Estimates of water flow during the Messinian flood, necessarily uncertain because no one measured that flow and calculations are made from models and deposit geometry, suggest flow rates of between 100 million and 1 billion cubic meters per second. 1 billion cubic meters per second is 5,000 times the Amazon's flow. It is 180,000 times Niagara Falls' flow. It is the greatest water flow that no modern continental flow can remotely compare. At those flow rates, the Mediterranean would have filled in an extraordinarily brief period. The estimates vary enormously depending on assumptions about the flow rate, which changed continuously as the passage widened. Some models suggest the Mediterranean could have filled in less than a year. Others suggest the process took several centuries. The uncertainty in those estimates is enormous, but even the slower extreme, several centuries, represents a nearly instantaneous event in geological terms. The kinetic energy released during the Zanclean flood was of extraordinary magnitude. Water falling several kilometers from the Atlantic level toward the dry Mediterranean floor converted gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy and then into heat and erosion energy. That energy heated the water locally at the impact point, produced steam, and eroded the channel bed with efficiency that no modern river or waterfall can match. The sound of that flood would have been audible at distances of hundreds of kilometers. Ground vibrations would have been perceptible much farther still. The spray of water pulverized by impact at the basin floor would have formed clouds that could have covered the sky over the Mediterranean during the entire flood duration. And the animals living on the coasts surrounding the basin would have witnessed an unprecedented spectacle. The sea being born from nothing, filling an empty basin at a speed that no modern natural process can equal. The speed at which the Mediterranean filled is one of the most debated questions of Messinian geology, and the answer depends largely on how the passage opening and barrier erosion process is modeled. The simplest model, assuming the passage opened relatively gradually and flow increased linearly, suggests filling over several centuries to several thousand years. The most dramatic model, assuming barrier erosion was positively fed back by the flow itself, so that each meter of erosion increased the flow that in turn increased erosion, suggests filling over months or even weeks. The conditions of the Mediterranean during filling would have been extraordinarily hostile for marine organisms attempting to colonize it. Atlantic water arriving with normal oceanic salinity, approximately 35 parts per thousand, fell onto a Mediterranean floor covered with solid salt and extremely concentrated brines. When Atlantic water began arriving and dissolving that salt, Mediterranean salinity would initially have been much greater than oceanic, possibly several times greater. The recovery of normal marine conditions after the Zanclean flood was also not instantaneous. The Mediterranean had to not just fill with water but also rebuild its biological communities, re-establish its nutrient cycling, redevelop its current patterns, and restore the chemical equilibrium that characterizes a functioning marine ecosystem. All of those processes took time, measured in thousands to hundreds of thousands of years rather than the months or centuries of the flood itself. The early Pliocene Mediterranean was a sea in transition, more diverse than the Messinian brine lakes but less diverse than the mature ecosystem it would become over millions of years of biological development. The early Pliocene Mediterranean, in the first hundreds of thousands of years after the Zanclean flood, was also a sea of unusual temperature and stratification. The extreme heat accumulated in the basin floor and lower water column during the drying phase would have taken time to dissipate. The Pliocene Mediterranean may have been warmer than expected for its latitude during those early post-flood centuries, as the residual heat of the Messinian evaporation slowly transferred to the overlying water column and then to the atmosphere. Organisms arriving with the first Atlantic waters would find themselves in an extreme salinity environment, killing most of them. Only the most salinity variation-tolerant organisms, the Euryhaline in biological terminology, could survive initial conditions. As dilution progressed and salinity normalized, more sensitive organisms could progressively colonize the Mediterranean. That process of progressive colonization, from most to least tolerant, with salinity normalizing as Atlantic water volume exceeded that of pre-existing brine, would have created a marine ecosystem being built in fast forward. The early Pliocene Mediterranean fossil records show an initially impoverished fauna dominated by generalist organisms, progressively enriching throughout the Pliocene as more Atlantic species colonized the sea and adapted to its conditions. The Pliocene Mediterranean communities, as we know them from their fossils, show an Atlantic fauna that colonized the newly filled Mediterranean and then gradually differentiated from its Atlantic relatives as the sea again isolated over time. That differentiation, occurring over the 5 million years since the Zanclean recolonization, produced the modern Mediterranean fauna, related to the Atlantic but distinct, less diverse but uniquely adapted to the Mediterranean-specific conditions of temperature, salinity, and seasonal variation. The geological evidence that could discriminate between those models is difficult to obtain because the Mediterranean has been covered by new sediments for more than 5 million years, erasing the details of the filling event. But some seismic studies of the Mediterranean floor have identified structures that could be the result of extremely energetic turbidity currents associated with rapid filling, consistent with filling at the faster end of the spectrum of possibilities. The chemistry of sediments at the Messinian-Pliocene boundary, the deposit formed in the first moments after filling, provides direct information about Zanclean flood conditions. Some of those sediments contain unusual mixtures of minerals not normally found together. Minerals of Atlantic marine origin mixed with Messinian evaporite minerals and continental minerals. That mixture reflects the extraordinary turbulence of the first filling phases, when flood currents resuspended dry Mediterranean floor sediments and mixed them with sediments arriving with Atlantic water. What the rapid filling would have produced in the Mediterranean would be equally dramatic. Atlantic water, salty but of normal oceanic salinity, falling onto the Mediterranean floor covered with salt, would have rapidly dissolved the surface salt and created dense brine that would have sunk to the basin floor while the lighter oceanic water occupied the surface. The newborn Mediterranean would have had an extraordinarily complex chemical structure, with layers of different salinities and densities taking time to mix until reaching equilibrium. The isostatic effects of Mediterranean filling are also recorded in the geological record. The weight of several thousand meters of water over the Mediterranean crust would have produced crustal depression, and that depression would have induced adjustments in surrounding regions that could have affected coastline height. In regions where earthquakes of the filling period are detectable in the sedimentary record, geologists can use those earthquakes to trace the isostatic adjustments associated with flooding. Mediterranean evaporation and subsequent filling were not isolated events without consequences for the rest of the planet. A sea the size of the Mediterranean cannot evaporate without producing effects on the global climate system, and those effects are one of the most active research fields in Messinian studies. The consequences of Mediterranean filling on the global ocean salinity are also a topic of active investigation. The modern Mediterranean is what oceanographers call a concentration Mediterranean Sea, a type of semi-closed basin with greater salinity than the open ocean because it evaporates more water than it receives from rivers. That greater salinity produces water denser than the overlying Atlantic water, which sinks and exits to the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, forming the Mediterranean water tongue that oceanographers can track at great distance in the Atlantic. The implications of the Messinian salinity crisis for our understanding of the Mediterranean's future are also important to consider. The sea that exists today exists because the Strait of Gibraltar remains open, allowing Atlantic water to compensate for Mediterranean evaporation. If that connection were severed, whether by tectonic closure or by some other mechanism, the Mediterranean would again begin evaporating. The time scale for significant evaporation to occur would be thousands of years, well within the range of human civilization. That is not a cause for immediate concern, but it is a reminder that the Mediterranean's continued existence depends on the maintenance of a specific geological configuration, and that configurations can change. The Mediterranean's role in the global climate system also extends to its effects on regional weather patterns that affect hundreds of millions of people. The Mediterranean climate, characterized by dry summers and wet winters, is directly produced by the presence of the sea and its interaction with the seasonal migration of the Azores high-pressure system. Without the Mediterranean, that climate type would not exist as we know it. The olive trees, the vineyards, the characteristic vegetation and agriculture of the Mediterranean region are all consequences of a sea that, as we have seen, might not have been there at all. The Mediterranean's influence on global climate also operates through its effect on the regional weather systems that affect the lands surrounding it. The Western Mediterranean Oscillation, the patterns of rainfall variation across the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and France, are directly modulated by the Mediterranean sea surface temperatures. The North African winter rainfall, critical for the region's agriculture, depends on Mediterranean moisture transport. All of those climate connections would have been absent during the Messinian drying, with consequences for regional ecosystems and, eventually, for the environmental context in which early hominid evolution was proceeding. When the Mediterranean refilled 5,300,000 years ago, it began exporting salty water to the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. That export, today approximately 800,000 cubic meters per second, contributes to North Atlantic salinity and therefore to the thermohaline circulation distributing heat in the North Atlantic. The absence of that contribution during the 200,000 years of maximum Mediterranean evaporation could have affected North Atlantic circulation in ways climate models are beginning to evaluate. The importance of North Atlantic thermohaline circulation for Western European climate cannot be overstated. Without the Gulf Stream and its extensions, Western European climate would be much colder in winter, comparable to North American regions at the same latitude like southern Canada. The Mediterranean's role in sustaining that thermohaline circulation makes the Mediterranean not just a local sea. It is a component of the global climate system. The Mediterranean also has a role in the ocean carbon cycle. Its relatively warm salty waters absorb carbon from the atmosphere and export it to the Atlantic. The interruption of that process during the Messinian salinity crisis would have modified the global oceanic system's carbon balance in ways not yet completely understood. Understanding those modifications has relevance not only for understanding the Miocene and Pliocene climate, but for understanding how changes to Mediterranean exchange with the Atlantic might affect the global carbon cycle in the future. The amount of water evaporated from the Mediterranean during the Messinian salinity crisis is enormous. If the Mediterranean has a volume of approximately 3,600,000 cubic kilometers, and if it was largely evaporated, that represents a water transfer from ocean to atmosphere and then to the basin floor salt deposits of significant magnitude. That amount of water represents approximately 3% of total world ocean volume. Removing 3% of ocean water has a measurable effect on global sea level. Estimates suggest that during maximum Mediterranean evaporation, global sea level could have fallen between 10 and 70 meters, depending on how much of the Mediterranean actually evaporated and what proportion of evaporated water was stored as salt on the basin floor rather than redistributed in the atmosphere and oceans. A global sea level drop of that magnitude has consequences for the geography of all continents. Shallow continental shelves, today underwater, would have been exposed. Shallow straits connecting seas and oceans could have closed or been restricted. Global oceanic circulation, which depends partly on ocean geometry and the straits connecting them, could have changed. The significance of the Zanclean refilling of the Mediterranean for global climate is also relevant for understanding the climatic transition that occurred in the Pliocene. The Pliocene began as a relatively warm period, with global temperatures several degrees above current ones and without permanent Arctic ice. That early Pliocene warmth could have been related in part to Mediterranean opening and the re-establishment of thermohaline circulation that the Mediterranean helps sustain. The Mediterranean, by expelling salty dense water toward the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, helps maintain the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation distributing heat in the North Atlantic. If that contribution was interrupted during Mediterranean evaporation, its re-establishment could have contributed to early Pliocene warming. How do geologists know all this? The Messinian salinity crisis was an event that ended more than 5 million years ago, long before any human existed and long before writing or any other form of historical record was developed. The story we have explored tonight was reconstructed from geological, sedimentological, paleontological, and geophysical evidence that scientists have been accumulating since the 1960s. The research progress in understanding the Messinian salinity crisis exemplifies how scientific understanding advances through accumulation and integration of evidence from multiple independent sources. In 1980, the crisis's causes were unknown and debated, with proposals ranging from sea level change to reduced Atlantic connections. By 2000, the evidence strongly supported near-complete evaporation and subsequent catastrophic refilling. By 2010, the geochemical signatures of warming, evaporation, and carbon cycle disruption had been documented globally. By 2020, high-precision dating and new geochemical proxies had further strengthened the picture. The Messinian salinity crisis research community has also contributed methodological innovations that have benefited broader geoscience. The challenge of dating events from 5 million years ago with precision of tens of thousands of years drove improvements in radiometric dating techniques. The challenge of identifying chemical signatures of evaporation in marine sediments drove development of new geochemical proxies. The challenge of modeling the Zanclean flood drove advances in computational fluid dynamics applied to geological problems. Scientific problems of sufficient difficulty tend to advance their fields in ways that extend well beyond the specific problem being solved. The legacy of the Messinian salinity crisis in popular culture has been surprisingly limited, given the extraordinary nature of the event. The Zanclean flood, arguably the greatest natural spectacle in Earth's recent history, has received far less cultural attention than the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs or even the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. That asymmetry between scientific importance and public recognition is partly a consequence of the event's invisibility. Unlike an asteroid impact, which leaves physical evidence at the surface, the Messinian evaporation and flood are recorded mainly in buried geological structures accessible only through scientific investigation. The documents that first described the Messinian salinity crisis after the 1970 boreholes are historical texts of modern geology. Kenneth Sue, William Ryan, and Maria Bianca Sita's 1973 article described the event and proposed its interpretation as near-complete Mediterranean evaporation. That article was initially received with skepticism by many geologists who found it too dramatic to be credible. In the following years, the accumulation of evidence from all the sources we have explored tonight converted initial skepticism into universal acceptance. That story, of a radical hypothesis initially rejected and then confirmed by accumulating evidence, is a perfect illustration of how the scientific process works. The international collaboration characterizing modern Messinian research is itself a reflection of the event's global nature. Because the crisis affected every part of the ancient Mediterranean simultaneously, fully understanding it requires data from every part of the ancient sea's surroundings. Spanish researchers have contributed the best-studied terrestrial sections. Italian researchers have studied the Sicilian and Apennine deposits. French researchers have characterized the Rhône and Provence sections. Greek and Turkish researchers have studied the Eastern Mediterranean record. Those national research traditions, each working on the most relevant geological record in their region, have together built the global picture no single country's geological record could have provided alone. The first serious indication that something extraordinary had occurred in the Mediterranean arrived in 1970, when the Glomar Challenger, the ocean drilling ship of the Deep Sea Drilling Project, drilled the Mediterranean floor at several points and found beneath normal marine sediments a layer of anhydrite and salt that clearly could not have formed under normal marine conditions. Anhydrite is a calcium sulfate mineral that only forms by intense evaporation of seawater, and finding it under the Mediterranean was an unequivocal signal that at some point the sea had experienced extreme evaporation conditions. Those 1970 Glomar Challenger boreholes are considered one of the most important scientific discoveries of 20th century oceanography. The scientific team aboard, on recovering the first cores with salt and anhydrite from the Mediterranean floor, immediately understood the importance of what they had found, though the complete interpretation of the event took years to develop. The scientific documents that first described the Messinian salinity crisis after the 1970 boreholes are historical texts of modern geology. Kenneth Sue, William Ryan, and Maria Bianca Sita's 1973 article described the event and proposed its interpretation as near-complete Mediterranean evaporation. That article was initially received with skepticism by many geologists who found it too dramatic to be credible. In the following years, the accumulation of evidence from all the sources we have explored tonight converted initial skepticism into universal acceptance. The research progress in understanding the Messinian salinity crisis over the past few decades exemplifies the way scientific understanding advances through accumulation and integration of evidence from multiple independent sources. In 1980, the causes of the crisis were unknown and debated. By 2000, the volcanic hypothesis for the Zanclean flood had gained strong support. By 2010, the geochemical signatures of the event had been documented globally. By 2020, new techniques had further strengthened the picture. That progressive refinement of understanding, driven by new techniques and new data, is the characteristic mode of scientific advance in geologically focused sciences. The post-Messinian Mediterranean that emerged after the Zanclean flood is different from the Mediterranean that existed before the Messinian salinity crisis. Not in fundamental geographic terms, because the position of the continents did not change substantially in those 5 million years. But in terms of the composition of its biological communities, the structure of its seafloors, and some aspects of its chemistry, the post-Messinian Mediterranean is a newly established sea. The post-Messinian Mediterranean that emerged after the Zanclean flood is different from the Mediterranean that existed before the Messinian salinity crisis in ways that matter for understanding the sea's biology, geology, and even human history. The modern Strait of Gibraltar, through which the Zanclean flood entered and through which Atlantic water continues entering the Mediterranean today, is one of the most intensively studied bodies of water in the world. Its two-layer flow system, with Atlantic surface water flowing east and Mediterranean deep water flowing west, has been monitored continuously for decades with current meters, temperature sensors, and salinity instruments. That monitoring has provided an extraordinarily detailed picture of how the Mediterranean-Atlantic exchange works and how it varies with seasons, tides, and longer-term climate variations. Understanding that exchange system is directly relevant for predicting how the Mediterranean will respond to future climate changes. The modern Mediterranean also faces environmental pressures from human activity that, while incomparably less severe than the Messinian evaporation, are reshaping the sea's biology and chemistry in significant ways. The introduction of non-native species through the Suez Canal, the overfishing of many commercial species, the pollution from coastal cities and industry, and the warming produced by climate change are all modifying the Mediterranean ecosystem. Understanding how the sea recovered from the near-total biological catastrophe of the Messinian event gives some context for thinking about the resilience and fragility of Mediterranean ecosystems under current pressures. The modern Mediterranean's marine fauna is fundamentally an Atlantic fauna that colonized the sea through the Strait of Gibraltar. Before the Messinian, the Mediterranean had developed over millions of years its own fauna, the result of species differentiation from their Atlantic ancestors. That pre-Messinian fauna was destroyed by evaporation. What survived was very little, and what repopulated the Mediterranean came almost completely from the Atlantic. The consequence: the modern Mediterranean is biologically younger than it geographically appears. The Mediterranean's history also includes the fascinating story of how Pleistocene glaciations repeatedly modified the sea's geography on human-relevant timescales. During glacial periods, when sea level fell by 50 to 120 meters, significant portions of the Mediterranean continental shelves were exposed. The Sicily Strait between Sicily and Tunisia, today 140 kilometers of sea, was during maximum glaciations much narrower or even partially emerged, facilitating crossing between Africa and Sicily. The Adriatic, today 100 to 200 meters deep in many places, was during glaciations largely an exposed plain across which Paleolithic humans could walk. Those glacial period exposures created corridors for human and animal dispersal that shaped the distribution of life in the Mediterranean region in ways still visible today. The presence of particular animal species on Mediterranean islands, the distribution of human genetic lineages, the timing of initial human colonization of various islands, all carry the marks of those periods when the sea level was lower and crossing barriers were smaller. Understanding the Messinian history and the Pleistocene sea level changes together provides the complete framework for interpreting Mediterranean biogeography. The modern Mediterranean's marine fauna is fundamentally an Atlantic fauna that colonized the sea through the Strait of Gibraltar when it opened 5,300,000 years ago. Before the Messinian salinity crisis, the Mediterranean had developed over millions of years its own fauna, the result of species differentiation from their Atlantic ancestors. That pre-Messinian fauna was destroyed by evaporation. What survived was very little, and what repopulated the Mediterranean after the flood came almost completely from the Atlantic. The Strait of Gibraltar, which was the entry gate for Atlantic water during the Zanclean flood, remains today the only connection of the Mediterranean with the world ocean. And that connection is crucial for the sea's functioning. The Mediterranean continues evaporating more water than it receives from rivers, and the water deficit continues being compensated by Atlantic water entry through the Strait of Gibraltar. The same process that almost destroyed the Mediterranean 5.5 million years ago continues active today, only with the Strait of Gibraltar as a valve regulating flow and preventing the situation from reaching the extreme it reached in the Messinian. The Strait of Gibraltar's depth is barely 300 meters at its shallowest point. If sea level fell 300 meters, or if the terrain forming the strait's threshold rose 300 meters, the Mediterranean would again be isolated from the Atlantic and the evaporation process would begin again. The post-Messinian history of the Mediterranean also includes the gradual transformation of its marine biodiversity in response to Pliocene and Pleistocene climate changes. Current climate change warming is producing new changes, with tropical species from the Atlantic and Red Sea through the Suez Canal arriving. The Mediterranean's biological dynamism has never stopped since the Zanclean recolonization. The Mediterranean is closing. Not metaphorically. It is a verifiable geological fact, measurable with GPS instruments, supported by decades of seismic and satellite geodesy data. Africa moves northward at approximately 2 centimeters per year. At that speed, the collision between Africa and Europe is inevitable in the geological future. And that collision is already producing its anticipatory effects. The earthquakes of northern Africa and southern Europe, the mountain chains continuing to rise in the Alpine Arc, the volcanic activity of southern Italy are all manifestations of the compression accumulating between the two continents. The Mediterranean is closing. Africa moves northward at approximately 2 centimeters per year. At that speed, Africa-Europe collision is inevitable in the geological future. And that collision is already producing its anticipatory effects. The earthquakes of northern Africa and southern Europe, the mountain chains continuing to rise in the Alpine Arc, the volcanic activity of southern Italy are all manifestations of the compression accumulating between the two continents. The Mediterranean's geological future is connected to a broader question about the fate of the world's ocean basins over geological time. The Atlantic is currently widening, as North America and Europe continue separating. The Pacific is currently shrinking, as Pacific oceanic crust is subducted under surrounding continents. Eventually, perhaps in 100 to 200 million years, the cycle of supercontinent formation may begin again, bringing the continents back together in a new Pangea-like configuration. In that hypothetical future, the Atlantic could close and the Pacific could open in a new cycle of oceanic creation and destruction. The Mediterranean story is a small chapter in that much larger story of how the world's ocean basins are born, live, and die on geological timescales. The future closure of the Strait of Gibraltar is not the only geological threat to the Mediterranean's continued existence. The opening of the East African Rift, which is slowly splitting the African continent along a line running from the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia through East Africa, could eventually produce a new oceanic basin in eastern Africa. If that process continues and the eastern fragment of Africa drifts northward and collides with Arabia and the Middle East, it could close the eastern Mediterranean in a completely different way than the tectonic closure of the Strait of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean's future is shaped by geological processes operating on multiple timescales and in multiple geographic locations simultaneously. The Strait of Gibraltar, today barely 14 kilometers at its narrowest point, will progressively narrow as Africa and Europe continue converging. At some moment in the geological future, perhaps within 10 or 20 million years, the strait could close again, replicating the conditions that produced the Messinian salinity crisis. And if that occurs, the Mediterranean will begin evaporating again. The volcanoes of the Mediterranean, Vesuvius, Etna, Santorini, are also manifestations of the active tectonics that will continue shaping the sea in the future. Those volcanoes result from the subduction of Mediterranean oceanic crust under surrounding plates, and their activity will continue as long as that subduction remains active. The great historical Mediterranean eruptions, like Santorini around 1600 BC, possibly related to Minoan civilization decline, are samples of that volcanic activity in action. The detailed tectonic models suggest that Africa-Europe convergence will produce first the closure of the eastern Mediterranean, where subduction of Mediterranean oceanic crust under the Eurasian plate is already advanced. The islands of the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, Crete, and others, are partly the result of that subduction and will continue being affected by it in the future. The western Mediterranean, where the Strait of Gibraltar provides the Atlantic connection, is more tectonically stable in the short term but equally vulnerable in the long term. The type of tectonic uplift that closed the Betic and Riffian corridors 6 million years ago could again be produced by Africa-Europe convergence. The Strait of Gibraltar, today barely 14 kilometers at its narrowest point, will progressively narrow as Africa and Europe continue converging. At some moment in the geological future, perhaps within 10 or 20 million years, the strait could close again, replicating the conditions that produced the Messinian salinity crisis. And if that occurs, the Mediterranean will begin evaporating again. Global warming also has implications for the future of the Strait of Gibraltar on much shorter timescales than tectonic closure. As sea level rises from polar ice melting, the strait's depth increases, potentially weakening the bottom current expelling dense Mediterranean water toward the Atlantic. If that bottom current weakens, it would change the Mediterranean's water balance and could affect North Atlantic thermohaline circulation in ways climate models are still evaluating. In a more distant future, of tens to hundreds of millions of years, the Mediterranean could be completely absorbed by Africa-Europe collision, producing a new Himalaya-sized mountain range in southern Europe and northern Africa. The marine sediments today lying on the Mediterranean floor would be folded and elevated, as occurred with Tethys sediments now forming the Alps and Himalayas. The consequences of the Mediterranean's future closure would extend far beyond the disappearance of the sea. The collision between Africa and Europe, of which Mediterranean closure would be the prelude, would produce a mountain chain comparable to the Himalayas in southern Europe and northern Africa. The Mediterranean cities of today, Rome, Barcelona, Athens, Cairo, would be buried under kilometers of rock or destroyed by the earthquakes and volcanism accompanying the collision. That future is millions of years away, but it is written in the physics of plate movement. The Mediterranean was not the only sea that disappeared or underwent radical transformation in the last few million years. The history of the planet's seas is full of water bodies that arose, prospered, and then disappeared as a consequence of tectonic plate movement and climate changes. The Mediterranean was not the only sea that disappeared or underwent radical transformation in the last few million years. The history of the planet's seas is full of water bodies that arose, prospered, and then disappeared as a consequence of tectonic plate movement and climate changes. The multiple scales at which the Mediterranean's history operates, from the molecular scale of isotopes in mineral crystals to the planetary scale of continental drift, illustrates something fundamental about how Earth science works. Understanding a geological event requires connecting evidence from many different scales and many different disciplinary perspectives. The micropaleontology of foraminifera, the geochemistry of evaporite minerals, the seismic imaging of buried canyons, the tectonic modeling of plate convergence, the climate modeling of evaporation and flooding. No single perspective is sufficient. The Mediterranean story required, and continues requiring, the coordinated work of scientists from many disciplines and many countries, each contributing a piece of a puzzle that none of them could solve alone. The geological concept of uniformitarianism, the idea that the geological processes we observe today are the same processes that have operated throughout Earth's history, is both confirmed and challenged by the Messinian salinity crisis. It is confirmed in that the physical and chemical processes producing the Messinian evaporites are the same ones producing salt deposits in modern salt lakes and coastal Salinas. It is challenged in that the scale of those processes during the Messinian far exceeded anything observable in the modern world, requiring not just the same processes but the same processes operating at intensities and durations far beyond current experience. The Paratethys Sea, the great water body covering Central and Eastern Europe during the Miocene, has its own story of gradual disappearance running parallel to the Mediterranean's but with its own particularities. The Paratethys extended from what is today Austria and Hungary to the Aral Sea, covering an area including the current Danube, Dniester, and Volga basins. As the Tethys closed and the Mediterranean was isolated, the Paratethys also lost its connection to the world ocean, progressively dividing into smaller basins that evolved independently. The Black Sea and the Caspian Sea are the two largest survivors of that ancient European inland ocean. The Black Sea itself has its own dramatic reflooding story. During Pleistocene glaciations, when Mediterranean sea level fell enough to sever the Bosphorus connection, the Black Sea became a freshwater lake fed only by its rivers. When the Mediterranean rose again at the end of glaciations, it flooded the Black Sea through the Bosphorus, in a smaller scale echo of the Zanclean flood. That event, occurring approximately 7,500 years ago, has been proposed as the origin of the biblical flood myth, a cultural memory of a catastrophic inundation experienced by the ancestors of the first civilizations. Mars' surface with its ancient salt deposits and dried lake beds represents a distant mirror of the Messinian Mediterranean, as we mentioned before. But the comparison goes deeper than just surface appearance. The same physical and chemical processes that produced the Messinian evaporites operated on Mars when its ancient seas and lakes evaporated. The same sequence of mineral precipitation, the same layered deposits, the same geochemical signatures. Understanding what happened in the Mediterranean helps interpret the Martian geological record, and understanding what happened on Mars might eventually tell us something about the range of outcomes possible when planetary-scale evaporation events occur. The Tethys Sea, of which the Mediterranean is the last remnant, was one of Earth's largest and most long-lived oceans, existing for more than 100 million years between the continental masses of Gondwana and Laurasia. The Tethys was closed by India's movement toward Asia, Africa's approach to Europe, and Arabia's collision with Asia, in a process lasting tens of millions of years that completely transformed the geography of the region, now including Europe, the Middle East, India, and Central Asia. The Paratethys was another great water body existing in what is now Central and Eastern Europe during the Miocene and part of the Pliocene. When the Tethys closed to the east, the Paratethys was isolated from the world ocean and progressively became a system of gigantic lakes that finally reduced to the current Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and Aral Sea. Whale and dolphin fossils found in Paratethys deposits in what are today Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine are testimony that these regions were under the sea in geologically recent times. Lake Baikal in Siberia is an example of a water body that could eventually become an ocean, though in a much more primitive development stage than the Mediterranean. Lake Baikal occupies an active rift, a continental crust fracture similar to those producing oceans in their initial stages. Baikal is widening at approximately 2 centimeters per year, the same rate as the Atlantic. If the rift continues long enough, Baikal could first become an inland sea similar to today's Red Sea and eventually a complete ocean. Mars' surface, with its ancient salt deposits and dried lake beds, the red planet's geological record suggesting it too had seas that evaporated, represents a distant mirror of the Messinian Mediterranean. The study of Messinian evaporites provides reference models for interpreting the salt deposits that Mars rovers have detected on the red planet's surface. The Mediterranean's geological history thus connects not only to Earth's past and future, but to the broader question of habitability throughout the solar system. There is a philosophical lesson in the Mediterranean's history that goes beyond geology. The sea that has been for millennia the center of the known world, the sea that gave name to entire civilizations and that still defines the Western imagination, that sea was dry. That simple and extraordinary reality puts in perspective any sense of permanence we might have about the world around us. There is a philosophical dimension to the Mediterranean story that connects to questions about permanence, identity, and what it means for something to exist in time. The cultures that built their identity around the Mediterranean, the Greeks who called themselves oikoumene, the Romans who called it Mare Nostrum, the medieval Islamic civilization that crossed it at its straits, did so in the context of a sea that seemed as permanent as the sky. Those cultures are long gone, transformed into what came after them. The sea remains. The stars shining tonight above the Mediterranean are mostly the same ones that shone above it 5 million years ago, when the sea was evaporating. The constellations have changed somewhat by the proper motion of stars, but the same stars, the same distant suns, illuminated the salt desert where today there is water. That stellar continuity, spanning geological and astronomical times simultaneously, is one of the broadest reference frames the imagination can construct. The universe does not know the Mediterranean exists, but the Mediterranean exists in the universe, and that is enough. Whatever sea or landscape is outside tonight, whatever sounds are audible in the dark, whether waves or wind or silence, those sounds belong to a world that has been changing for 4.5 billion years and will continue changing for billions more. The night is a small moment in that change, and the sleep arriving now is smaller still, and both are real and sufficient. But the sea is also changed. The Mediterranean that Phoenician traders crossed is not exactly the same sea that Minoan sailors crossed before them, and neither is exactly the Mediterranean of Roman times, and none of those are exactly the Mediterranean of today. The sea has evolved biologically, chemically, physically over those millennia. What persists is the water, the basin, the general geography. What changes is everything else. That combination of persistence and change, of the sea remaining while constantly being renewed, is perhaps the deepest truth about what the Mediterranean's geological history reveals. The sea is not a thing. It is a process. A dynamic equilibrium between water flowing in and water evaporating out, maintained by the geology of the Strait of Gibraltar and the physics of the Atlantic. When that equilibrium was disrupted 5 million years ago, the process stopped and the sea disappeared. When the equilibrium was restored, the process restarted and the sea reappeared. The night coming now is a night over that process, over that dynamic equilibrium that has been maintaining the Mediterranean for 5 million years and will continue maintaining it for millions more, unless the plates close the Strait of Gibraltar again. And in the context of that process, that immense ongoing geological process, the sleep coming is a very small moment of rest in a very large story. Humans tend to experience landscape as something given, as the invariable backdrop on which history unfolds. Mountains seem permanent because they have been there since before any living person can remember. The sea seems permanent because it has always been where it is. The world's geography that we know seems the only possible geography because it is the only one we have ever seen. The story of the Messinian Mediterranean reminds us that that sense of permanence is illusory. The Mediterranean disappeared and came back, and did so in times so geologically recent that its inhabitants, if something like humans had existed then, could have seen the process unfold over the course of generations. The planet we inhabit is not a fixed stage. It is a system in constant change, operating at speeds exceeding human perception but perfectly detectable with geology's instruments. The geologists who study geological timescales have a practice that proves useful for intellectually inhabiting the immensity their science requires, finding anchors in the present that connect deep time to everyday experience. A rock on the beach is an anchor. The Mediterranean visible from the coast is an anchor. The gypsum deposits in the ranges of southeastern Spain are anchors. They are not only scientific evidence. They are also temporal windows, contact points between the lived present and the geological past normally accessible only in the abstract. When one knows that gypsum formed on the Mediterranean floor 5 million years ago, the gypsum ceases being simply a yellowish rock. It becomes a message from a time when the sea visible from the coast did not exist, when the landscape that today seems natural was radically different. And that connection, between the rock one can touch and the history it represents, is what geology can give to anyone who learns to read it. That perspective should not produce anxiety. Geological change occurs on timescales, making any human concern about it unnecessary. The Mediterranean will not close again in any time horizon relevant to any living person or any near future generation. What that perspective does produce, if inhabited correctly, is a particular calm. The calm of understanding that you are part of a much larger process than any human history, that the world in which you live has a history extending far before you existed and will extend far after you have disappeared. Tonight we have traveled to a time when the Mediterranean did not exist. We have seen the slow process of its evaporation, the salt deposits it left, the canyons the rivers carved at the edge of the empty basin. We have seen the strange world of the Messinian Basin, with its brine lakes and its cliffs kilometers high. And we have seen the return of the water, the greatest flood that Earth has produced in millions of years, filling in months or centuries a basin that had taken thousands of years to empty. The geological record of the Mediterranean tells us something that all great geological stories tell, that the world is larger than our experience of it, older than our history of it, and more dynamic than our static perception of it. The sea that seems so permanent, so defining of the landscapes and cultures we associate with the word Mediterranean, is a recent and temporary feature on the planetary surface. It is an accident of tectonic history that could have gone differently and will eventually go differently. The Mediterranean tomorrow morning will be what it has been every morning for 5 million years, a sea of water in motion, receiving sunlight and reflecting it back, sheltering the life that colonized it after the Zanclean flood, slowly evaporating and slowly being replenished by the Atlantic. The story of its disappearance and return, explored tonight in the dark, will be a story contained in the rock below the waves, invisible but present, the geological foundation of everything that floats above it. Sleep comes now as the ocean continues. But within that larger geological story, the human story of the Mediterranean is not diminished. The sea that Socrates saw and Caesar crossed and Ibn Battuta sailed is the same body of water we have been exploring tonight, the same water that filled during the Zanclean flood, the same water that will eventually evaporate again when the Strait of Gibraltar closes. The continuity of that water, across human and geological time, is the thread connecting all the chapters of the Mediterranean story. There is something calming in the movement of water at night. The sound of waves arriving at a shore, regular and soft, indifferent to human preoccupations. The sea does not know it almost ceased to exist. It does not know it will someday cease to exist again. It simply moves, as water does, following the physics of tides and winds and the slow breathing of the ocean. Tonight, listening to those waves in imagination, or to the silence of a room where the sea is only a memory or a map, the story of the Mediterranean's disappearance and return can accompany the descent into sleep. A story about deep time, about the patience of geological processes, about the unexpected fragility of things that seem most solid, and about the extraordinary fact that the sea came back and has stayed and is still there, moving in the dark. It is a story about the impermanence of the things that seem most permanent. The sea is not eternal. The coastlines are not eternal. The countries looking out on the Mediterranean, the cities built on its shores, the cultures that gave name to that sea, all are ephemeral on the geological scale we have explored tonight. Not on the human scale, where the Mediterranean is a constant that has been there since long before the first historical record. But on Earth's scale, which operates in millions of years, the Mediterranean is a temporary visitor, a body of water that appeared when the plates organized in a particular way and will disappear when they reorganize differently. And yet it is there right now. The Mediterranean exists tonight, as it has existed for the last 5 million years, full of salt water and life, receiving Atlantic waves through the Strait of Gibraltar with the same consistency with which it has received them for 5 million years. The temporary is not less real for being temporary. The Mediterranean is real right now, with all its breadth and all its depth and all the human history its shores have sheltered. And that present reality is not diminished by the fact that in the geological future the sea will change and eventually disappear again. The planet continues its course, calm and indifferent to any human concern. Continents drift. Seas open and close. And on the scale of that movement, the Messinian Mediterranean is just one of many episodes in a history that began long before any eye existed to see it and that will continue long after the last human eyes close. The stars shining tonight above the Mediterranean are mostly the same ones that shone above the Mediterranean 5 million years ago, when the sea was evaporating. The constellations have changed somewhat by the proper motion of stars, but the same stars, the same distant suns, illuminated the salt desert where today there is water. That stellar continuity, spanning geological and astronomical times simultaneously, is one of the broadest reference frames the imagination can construct. The universe does not know the Mediterranean exists. But the Mediterranean exists in the universe, and that is enough. Tonight, as sleep approaches, the Mediterranean is still there. Millions of cubic kilometers of salt water in continuous motion, not knowing that 5 million years ago they were not there, not knowing that in 5 million more they might not be again. Just water, moving in the present, as it always has. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark.